Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Julia and I attempt to answer a question. Is it wise to write your personal statement on your intended area of study? Our question from a listener is a SpeakPipe question from an anonymous listener in Florida who wants to know how colleges read and interpret transcripts from the state of Florida. Our interview, Julia's back again, and she's joined by her great friend, Lydia Dagenais, who did admissions at both Haverford and Swarthmore. And Julia and Lydia will be talking about Haverford, Swarthmore, and the BICO and TRICO Coalition. And that'll be part 1 of 2, but Lydia will be with us for the next 2 weeks to discuss an entirely different subject after that. And our college spotlight, Marquette University. Lisa will join me for that. So for you fans of college spotlights, you'll be getting Haverford, Swarthmore, some Bryn Mawr, and Marquette all in one episode. Hey, Julia.
Hi, Mark.
I'm super excited. I think we have a great topic, one we've talked about before in our news section. But before we get to that, we're going to give our listeners 2 tips and admissions vernacular and pass on the big number this week. So Julia's going to lead with the tip, and then I'm actually going to interact with her on the next one. So fire away, Julia.
So this time of year, sort of like the early February to early March is maybe my favorite in the cycle as a college counselor, because it's more the exploratory time for maybe sophomores and especially juniors to really start their process. And I get a little reprieve of worrying about the news for my seniors between some of those early action, late news, and then the regular decision news coming out. One thing I feel like I saw my seniors really struggle with this year was sort of making sure that they attended to specific demonstrated interest needs of each college that they were applying for. And what I found is that they might have done all the other things they need to do for these applications, but sometimes the demonstrated interest was an afterthought. And that got us into hot water at certain schools. Maybe they've tracked demonstrated interest over time, and it did appear, because that's what they were doing, they were kind of just trying to cram it all in at once. Or especially if a school utilizes interviews, whether or not that's for demonstrated interest, is that if you're not kind of early, if the school allows you to request one before you've applied to the college, if you're not sort of early with that, the spots fill up really quickly. And so I have a lot of students who kind of, when regular decision came around, had not sort of done their due diligence there. So I always recommend having some sort of spreadsheet or tool that you use to kind of keep track of every college. And unfortunately, it's not fully transparent for every college about demonstrated interest and how they like it. Some will include that in their common data set. Some will not. Some will outright just put the policies on a website. Usually that's for a school that doesn't measure demonstrated interest. They'll just let you know that. And honestly, I don't know about you, Mark, but I believe 99% of the time when the school says, we don't engage in demonstrated interest, that's really the case. It's not Harvard being like, oh, just kidding. We definitely want you to be contacting us all the time. But some schools are really interesting. They literally do their enrollment models, sort of figuring out who they're going to yield based on some really funny, to me, demonstrated interest metrics, right? So it's not just the simple, I went to campus. If there's an interview, I did that. I saw someone at a college fair. But there's some colleges who, for example, will look at the percentage of emails opened from the college, how many links within that email you clicked, how long you were on each of those websites. And I know it's kind of like a full-time job, honestly, sometimes for students. And so the earlier you can start with it, the less of a headache that's going to be. So especially and I've said this before, if you've got a parent or a guardian that is really eager to assist you on this college process and you would like them to be maybe not overly involved, this is usually actually a great sort of thing that you can partner with your family on with this, is sort of create the spreadsheet together, assign the research to half and half. Maybe you look online, maybe parents or guardians look online. And then each college will have a different sort of nuanced answer. Most of the time, unfortunately, you might need to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So you might have to go to a college fair. You might need to go to a virtual or in-person information session where you're able to ask questions. Do you track demonstrated interest, and how do you track demonstrated interest? So actually, it's kind of a lot of research when I think about it. I know, I'm so sorry. All this time that you all put into your applications and thoughtfulness. But if you start earlier, maybe with a school that does look at things like, did you open my emails? It's going to be easier to kind of like open 1 out of every 3 emails instead of every single one post November 1. So that is sort of something I've been thinking about for juniors and even sophomores. It might make your inbox not so fun for your email, but the earlier you start, the better sort of heads up you have about what you might need to do to really show schools interest. And it can rest on your candidacy, right? I feel for my kids who get put on the wait list or denied because they just don't think they're yieldable because they haven't shown demonstrated interest. So it actually is in the best interest of your candidacy to kind of be on top of this if the college you're looking at or applying to does measure demonstrated interest.
So a couple of questions for you and a comment or two. So do you ever hear feedback from schools in counselor calls that we just didn't think the student was coming, or, you know what I mean? Can you talk about that?
Always, yes. For schools that do measure demonstrated interest.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does happen a lot more often in small liberal arts colleges. Oftentimes that's because it's a really self-selecting group of students, right? And that you're looking for, oftentimes they're maybe not in urban settings, oftentimes maybe don't have engineering, oftentimes they are, you're maybe looking to be an anonymous person or one in a huge lecture class. So already it's self-selecting, but almost always, or by a lot of strong metrics, students who don't have any demonstrated interest with a small liberal arts college, like we call them stealth applicants, we're like, how did they even come to us? Like usually it's through some sort of channel. Like maybe I went to a college fair, maybe I came for a visit. Almost never did we yield a stealth applicant at a small liberal arts college. And when you have so little space and you're really crafting a very small intentional community, those little pieces can matter a lot. It also happens a lot if the student is maybe above profile. So maybe their academics and their extracurriculars would be in like the top 1% of the applicants that applied. If that applicant didn't show demonstrated interest at a school that measures it, that school often waitlists because they're like, we are totally their backup. There's no way they're going to come. And listen, if they don't love us, we don't love them either. So I do hear a lot from especially smaller schools that like, oh, they did an interview, or, oh, hey, I reached out and they didn't answer me. Or I've even had schools like University of San Diego, for example. I had a student who was admitted early action and then never opened their admit letter. And they also didn't respond to requests for financial aid information. And so that student, they just, even though they're admitted, they actually ended up just denying that student. And because it was clear that the student just wasn't interested, right?
Now, wait a minute. How'd they go from admitted to denying? He's saying they pulled their offer?
I should say they pulled their merit scholarship offer.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Thank you. And then also the student also tanked their semester too. So they did get their admission rescinded. But actually what was kind of sad is that student actually really could have used that money. And had they just simply opened it, I think we could have had a conversation with them about reinstating the scholarship, and also a conversation about the poor grades semester too. But often I think the most common thing I hear for a school that measures demonstrated interest and the student didn't show any is that the student will be on a wait list. But it is true that the student can sometimes be denied. And it's a luxury, a privilege, an unfair one, that kids at private schools can often have their counselors call, and then I can maybe fill in like, oh, sorry, the student is a boarding student and they went to sign up for an interview and they were too late and all those things. But at least I can be a point of contact on demonstrated interest. That's not the reality of the majority of students applying. And even then, when I've said to, a school like, oh, the student went to sign up for an interview, but it was full, they're like, okay, well, then they weren't clearly into us early on, because they would have done that. So it can still come to bite you.
Yeah, and if people heard the Andy Strickler interview, he said just this, in part 2 of that interview, he said sometimes we strongly have reason to believe a student may not be coming, and sometimes we'll pick up the phone if they have coming from a school where they have a college counselor and talk to the counselor and get that read on a kid. I tell students that really assiduously, diligently research your colleges. And if you really do that, then you'll be sort of scoring demonstrated interest points all the way, right? Because all the things that you would be doing to do the research could be the interview, could be preparing really well for the college-specific questions. So you answer them with depth and substance and specificity, opening the emails, showing up when they come to your school, going to fairs when they come to fairs, attending all their virtual presentations. As a natural byproduct of your research, you will be doing the things that indicate to a school a level of engagement, because it's really engagement is what we're talking about, right? Those two are really used interchangeably, interest and engagement. You'll be demonstrating the engagement to them so that they think that there's a chance that, you'll consider them. The one thing I probably would say a bit different than how you phrased it, Julia, is I find there's still a lot of people who say that they don't look at demonstrated interest. And Julia's nodding over here, so we probably don't disagree. And they actually do. And now, are they being disingenuous? Not necessarily, because sometimes it's different. People are working off a different definition. So sometimes people, like when they say they don't look at demonstrated interest, what they mean is we don't hire a third-party vendor, data quant, to crunch all of these statistics and come back and say this kid has a 79% chance of coming and this kid has a 13. Like, we don't do that with some elaborate model. And if they don't do that, then they say we don't use demonstrated interest. But any school that offers early decision has demonstrated interest built in, absolutely. I would argue, and I've said this directly to admission reps at both schools more than once, Georgetown and MIT have their own application. They've completely built interest into their process by making you do an entire application just for them, right? So I see it more as, at least for private schools, and you're right, especially the liberal arts, demonstrated interest is normally a part of the process. And I feel it should be the default position on the part of the applicant to assume that interest is going to matter.
Agreed.
Yeah. Now, where you tend to see it not as much is bigger publics.
Mm-hmm.
I believe them totally. Gary Clark I've interviewed on here from UCLA, Rick Clark from Georgia Tech. They have been very clear. Like Rick likes to say, the only demonstrated interest for us is, did you apply?
Yeah.
And with those places, it really boils down more to things like waitlists and defers. That's pretty much their interest metric. Like, did you choose to stay on the wait list? Okay, we do want to know that the wait list are people who legitimately will pick us. But I have a very broad definition of demonstrated interest. To me, is if an admission officer thinks one student is not likely to come, will that factor into their thinking in any way? And I would say for the overwhelming majority of them, the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so They may define it by, like what I find with the more selective schools, oftentimes it's, did you apply early and did you crush the custom questions?
Yep.
That's like their way of evaluating it. As you move down the selectivity, spectrum a little bit, it can get a lot more elaborate. And then sometimes for the really high admit schools, they don't necessarily look at it as much because they're not the ones that are really trying to drive their admit rate down and have pressure to show a lower admit rate every year. The schools that are admitting like 80% and higher, would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah. So we agree. We just sort of phrased it a little differently because Julia was nodding over here and everything I said.
Yes. I'm particularly interested in the small liberal arts colleges that have removed supplements and say they don't track demonstrated interest. Because then I'm like, but how? Like, how do you find fits then if you're not tracking demonstrated interest? Like, I'm really curious how that works at those schools.
And then there's the rise, of course, of the ones that throw them in the portal.
Yeah.
Add Colgate to that list now.
Right. Which is another way to determine, like who's going to complete the app. Right. So
that bothers me because like you've paid your money. You might have even factored how hard the application was into whether you apply. You've submit and then you find out, oh, I'm not going to be taken seriously unless I answer these additional questions. But anyway,
agreed.
So good one on that. So this is the second tip, and I want to just get Julia's thoughts on this. When students are choosing to write a personal statement, they have a lot of choices on topics they can write on. And one topic you can always write on is why you're interested in the major that you're interested in. That's why I want to be a doctor, why I want to be a vet. That's always a possibility, but that can sometimes have pros and cons to picking that topic. I'll just leave it open-ended, Julia, and I see you nodding over here, so I think we're on the same wavelength. So take that away and sort of explain what people need to be aware of if they're choosing to do the personal statement on sort of why they're interested in the major/career they like.
Yeah, I think, I'm not to say that it of course, it's very contextual. It really depends on the student for sure. I do think, though, I want to be sure that listeners or anyone in this process doesn't feel they need to address that in their personal statement, Common App essay, whatever you want to call it, and or also like the need to end, like it also to serve as like and this is why I'm ready for college and want college. It does not need to do that. And I feel like a lot of students maybe assume that there needs to be that kind of chatter. The dangers that one runs into if you do choose to write about sort of your major of choice or maybe career that you hope to go into and how you're going to steer your academics towards that in college is a couple things. One is that more often these days, colleges now ask in a supplemental question, like, maybe not necessarily, actually sometimes very obviously, like, why did you choose the majors you chose and why do you want to study them here? Or even just why do you want to study what you want to study in general? And or I hear a lot of, and I really like this question because I think it's a little more open-ended, but what's a particular intellectual experience you had that really ignited something in you, right? And that answer tends to usually fall in the same category of this is why I chose the major that I'm choosing. So you don't want to be redundant. And also you might not want to reduce your whole self to sort of what you want to study in college. And I'll I'll take that back in a second. But if you have something, if the personal statement is meant to be your one thing that goes to nearly all the colleges you're applying for, you might sound a little one-trick pony between your answers to the supplements and then also your essay, or that we didn't really learn anything about you except maybe what you want to learn, which is where I think it could be a good idea is actually if the major of choice or the career you're hoping to have actually directly aligns with a value or an experience of yours that was really defining for who you are, then I see that working pretty well. I just read an essay about a student whose brother has a terminal illness, and it was an awesome essay about how essentially, yes, that's what ignited her interest in being pre-med and maybe going to medical school. But the whole essay was really more about like how there's so little research, and she sees it as like a social justice thing to enter into health and medicine, to really bring voice and awareness to many issues in society that aren't going on. So it wasn't necessarily about a cancer condition. It was more about what are some of the other ills of society, and how do we correct those? And probably my favorite example, and I won't say her name because she'd kill me, is one of my advisees this year. So my advisees are also my college counselees this year. They're gluttons and chose to stick with me through the process.
It's because you're awesome.
I hardly. You should ask them. I do make them cupcakes, so that keeps
there
me
you go.
In their favor. But she is really interested in being an engineer, but to her, it's about the mindset of an engineer. It's not like, oh, I want to be a mechanical engineer and do X, Y, and Z. So her personal statement was an example of why she taught herself shorthand and why she got something out of that. And then another example of she has a pretty annoying older brother, and they share a bathroom, and she actually created her own contraption out of pulleys and wires and cardboard, where if her brother moves the soap in the bathroom to his side of the bathroom, it pops a balloon and water comes right down on his head, right? But the whole essay was really about why she wants to be an engineer, but it walked us through what is her mindset, how does she think, like what, and it's really about how she likes learning and creating. She likes the R&D, she likes all these things. So as much as it was about why she'd like to be an engineer, it said so much more about how she thinks and who she is as a person and the expression of that, rather than a sort of very explicit, like, I hope to be an engineer because I want to build cars or something like that. So I think I usually try to stay away from those explicit answers, like, I want to be a doctor to help people, or
Sure,
I want to be actually the lawyer ones I think go pretty well too, because often it comes from a place of advocacy or agency where a student had a defining moment in there. But I would say that I like to stay away from major chat, or that being the theme of the main essay, if it's not really directly related to articulating something really important about who you are as a person.
Yeah, and I love the nuance you brought up there, because there are definitely times when people should do that. It makes sense in certain instances to have that essay. So we're not saying never go there. I can give an example of a student I worked with a few years ago who she wondered what was wrong with her until age 7, because people were talking about all this stuff in school and she didn't know what the heck was going on, and she couldn't see what was going on she couldn't see what was going on the blackboard. So parents took her to an ophthalmologist, and she was like legally blind. And so it was like this complete epiphany when that got addressed. I can't remember if it was glasses or contacts, which led to this 10-year mentor relationship with the ophthalmologist. And now she wants to be an ophthalmologist to have the lights come on for another 7-year-old girl sitting somewhere that wonders what's like. That made a super powerful essay.
Totally.
And that student did really well in the college process. So like there are places for it, especially when you really delve into the why, and you can have the lights go on and the epiphany that in that longer word count, you can build something out. But the thing I tell students is, what you can't do, if you do that, then you need to be prepared to have almost something different to use, because if that school also has a why this major, they don't want to hear part 2 on that. So if you want to go there, then I want you to use a different essay for the school that's also saying the why major. And so if you're prepared to do that, that's fine. And so it's not a never do it, but just realize that every aspect of the application process, admission officers want to be learning new things that help explain who you are. And so if there's that so much overlap between the college specific essay, custom questions, and then the personal statement is gonna fall flat. And that, so it's just something to be aware of. So awesome. Friends, Julia and I were originally going to talk about the topic, Where Are All the Boys? A great article that appeared in the Bowdoin Orient, their school newspaper. We're going to get to that, but next week we'll have more admissions tips for you. Hope you'll join us next week.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, I reached out to Marissa Salazar, an admission officer at Colorado College, Associate Director of Admission. You may remember her. She did the excellent 5-part series for us on 6 different types of school ways to visit a college. And Marissa's from Florida. She's worked in admissions in Florida. She currently has Florida as her territory. And so we had a couple Florida questions come in, and I thought she'd be the best person to answer them, and she graciously obliged. During my interview with Marissa, she talked about how complicated Florida transcripts are to read, which is one of the reasons she was actually assigned Florida as her territory. So I have a question for her about Florida, and our listener has a SpeakPipe question about Florida. Okay, friends, I have a surprise for you and a treat. You heard from Marissa Salazar a little while ago. Well, it did not escape me. A couple of things she said in her interview. One was that Florida's transcripts are difficult. She's from Florida, so she got assigned Florida. And I remember thinking at the time, I bet our listeners wonder what she means by that. So, Marissa, why don't you tell our listeners what makes Florida transcripts difficult? And then we had a Florida mom send in a question that I want her to address.
Very excited to address this. I get flack for this all the time, here at CC. But yeah, I think Florida transcripts are difficult to read because there's so much information on the transcripts. It can be overwhelming, especially for someone that's a little less seasoned, I think, in the admission profession. The first page of the transcript is vaccination records from when this child was literally an infant. Some of the transcripts date back to kindergarten. And so we're like, wow, Johnny passed finger painting and, did well in fractions. And, it can be overwhelming to have a 24-page transcript with vaccination records, testing records, FCAT, all the way up until, their senior year. So I think that's what I meant by they're harder to read.
Now, what's FCAT? What's FCAT?
Oh, gosh, Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test. It's a standardized test in Florida that folks have to take every year to basically move up to the next grade level. Mm-hmm. It's been a while since I've talked about FCAT.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you actually when you get to the actual 9, 10, 11, 12 grade, is there anything that makes it difficult there as well?
Not at all. No. Yeah, I think once we finally reach page 16 of the transcript and we get past all of the, elementary school nonsense, that makes a lot of sense. I would also say that sometimes students that are dual enrolling or doing Florida virtual school, which is really popular, those are parsed out differently in the transcript. So it'll show a student's classes at the high school, and then right underneath that, it'll say Florida Virtual School and the classes they're taking there, and then another subsection of, Valencia Community College and the classes that they're taking there, and they don't always show up in order and which grade they took those in. So that can sometimes be a little confusing as well. But again, folks that are more seasoned in the profession and have actually laid eyes on a Florida transcript are more familiar. And my own transcript is 26 pages, being from Florida as well. So I'm definitely more familiar with them.
Awesome. Okay. And Marissa's going to answer a SpeakPipe question that came in from a listener.
Hello, I am an anonymous mom from Florida. My question is, the ACE program, Cambridge Advanced International Certificate of Education, is popular in Florida state high schools, and its courses are promoted as being equivalent to AP and IB in credits and rigor. When passing the required 7 ACE exams, the student also qualifies for the Bright Future Scholarship. How do college admissions officers view ACE courses when evaluating a student's transcripts, especially non-Florida schools?
So, Marissa, what can you tell us about ACE and how it relates to reading transcripts and Florida students?
Yeah. So being that I'm from Florida, I myself took a lot of ACE courses when I was in high school, and I would say that they definitely are viewed on par in terms of an AP, IB type of curriculum, in terms of rigor level, in terms of credits that they're awarded. I know there's always been a lot of question about, AP, IB, and ACE equivalents of what it will count for when it comes to, an English class or math class in college and things like that. So it definitely does have equivalency when transferring into institutions. It really, Mark, if I'm being honest, is a school by school basis, right?
Sure.
So for CC, for example, we will accept AP and IB credits, but ACE aren't as popular. But in the reading process, they are counted as rigorous as an AP or IB course. Versus in Florida, when I worked for the University of Central Florida, we would give credit for ACE, AP, and IB. So it really just quite depends on the institution. But I will say, to answer this person's question, that they are deemed as, almost cream of the crop, you could say, right? Of like, they are as rigorous as AP or IB would be.
And tell our listeners what a ACE course is.
An ACE class, so the official terminology is a Cambridge Advanced International Certificate of Education. And I want to say it's through Cambridge, which is overseas. So it's quite popular in the European markets. So the ACE program, the Cambridge Advanced International Certificate of Education, those classes are taught what would be equivalent like AP and IB that are in the classroom settings. A lot of the courses are standardized versus, you'll take a social science, you'll take a natural science, you'll take a math, and there are levels to those courses that a student can take, kind of like an IB curriculum where you have the standard level and the higher level. And ACE courses, it works sort of in that same nature, where a student will have usually about 6 to 7 core classes they have to take, and they range anywhere from your English, math, and science, language, so on and so forth. And they can obtain a specialized ACE diploma at the end of their time in that program. And like I mentioned before, some institutions will grant that as college credit and some will not. It just is a college by college basis.
Very similar to dual credit or dual enrollment.
Exactly.
That's going to be totally school by school dependent. And I don't know if it's similar in this regard. A lot of times public schools tend to be more supportive of dual credit, dual enrollment in general than selective independent schools when it comes to the credit component.
Absolutely.
I don't know do you think there's similarities with ACE that way or not?
I would say so. Yeah. In my time in Florida, it seemed like all colleges in Florida, whether they were public or private, tended to accept that because of how popular it is in Florida schools. But even here in Colorado, I couldn't name a single school that does, ACE credits for college credit. So I really think it's state by state. If it's cases where it's more popular in the South, perhaps they're a little bit more familiar with it and can compare of like what that equivalent's going to look like on their side of things. But as far as like my experience here in Colorado and my peer institutions, there aren't many. But that goes for dual enrollment as well. Just as far as the rigor level of those courses at the community college that the student is taking it at, what it would be equivalent to here, which is, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, why I always tell students, keep your classes general, right? When you get into the weeds of, computer science and data and these, really niche different courses, those really tend not to transfer well, especially in a highly selective type of environment or liberal arts institution.
And you're talking about transfer in as credits that you come in with.
In high school, yes. You're graduating high school, you've taken dual enrollment through high school, yes.
Sure. But that may be different than being deemed as whether they were rigorous or not, and you get credit for rigor.
Exactly, yeah. So dual enrollment, AP, IB, ACE, those are all equally across the playing field considered rigorous.
Are ACE courses ever taught in classes in the high school? Like I know there are places where AP classes and IB classes are taught right in the high school. Dual credit, dual enrollment classes are taught right in high schools. Like professors come in and occupy the high school classroom and the student doesn't have to leave the building, in their actual high school. That happens right here in Atlanta, and other markets as well. Does that happen with ACE? Like, is the student going to a location like you would go to a community college or go to a public school to take a dual enrollment class? Because these are not virtual. These are taught in real time with real instructors, right?
Right.
What's that setup?
I have found from my experience that it works the same like an AP or IB where it's happening at the student's high school. It's not like contracted out by any means or hosted at another location. But teachers need to be certified to teach that type of course material, if that makes sense. So at least when I was in school, they were taught at my high school. The counselor, or the teacher, I should say, was versed and able to teach ACE level classes.
Are these the kind of things that you provide some training for, like admission officers, like at CC, that are like maybe new or this first time they're seeing Florida transcript and like, what's this ACE everywhere? Like, is this where you kind of come in and provide a little background for them?
You're giving me a great idea to like incorporate a Florida 101 training and reader training next year. No, but yes, so at Colorado College, we do team-based reading, and being that I oversee Florida, I get to work with pretty much everyone on my team of reading those files and getting to introduce some folks to the ACE credits or the 26-page long transcript in general and how to navigate those. Or be able to sit with the more seasoned folks and just give them sort of refreshers. But yeah, absolutely. I don't want to say I'm the Florida know-it-all by any means, but I do think that folks tend to come to me and I'm able to educate on what these types of things mean. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it only makes sense. You grew up there,
Well,
you
of
went to high
course.
school there, you worked in
Yes.
college there, did admissions there, right?
Exactly.
Why not?
Yes.
You got to use your
exactly.
talents.
Why not?
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Marissa, for coming back again and contributing again to help our listeners. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, you're in for a treat today. Lydia Dagenais and her good friend Julia Esquivel together. And we're going to be talking about all things Haverford College, Swarthmore College, and the BICO and TRICO Coalition. So in part one, Lydia shares her backstory. I asked Lydia, the students that pick Swarthmore over Haverford, why did they do it? And the students that pick Haverford over Swarthmore, why did they do it? And Julia explains the BICO and the TRICO Consortium and the Quaker Consortium for those who are not familiar with it. Listen and enjoy. Friends, you're in for a real treat today. We're here with Lydia Dagenais, and Lydia's had a number of roles in college admissions. We're also here with Julia. Welcome to Your College Bound Kid, Lydia and Julia.
Hi.
Hi, Mark. This is very exciting for me. Lydia's one of my favorite people in the world.
I know. Julia is always talking to me about you, Lydia. And
Oh my gosh.
and she had the suggestion for you for this, which I was really thrilled about. So we're going to have some fun today, and we're just going to have a conversation. But before we dive in, why don't you talk about the different roles you've had in admissions and college counseling and walk us right up to what you're doing today, just so our listeners will understand the context from which you speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got started in admissions working at Haverford College. And so that's when I met Julia. And I was there for 5 years. I worked my way up from being an admission counselor up to I guess I was a senior assistant director when I left. Left to go to grad school, did a higher education program at Penn for a year, and thought I might do something in a different field of admissions, but nope, admissions kept calling me back. And in fact, Ryan Keaton was the one who kind of put the Swarthmore bug in my ear. And so after I graduated, I worked at Swarthmore in admissions for a couple of years as an associate dean of admissions. And actually, at that point, I had a kid and was looking to move back to Kansas City, which is where I'm from, and be able to afford a house and things like that. So while I was doing that job search, I actually left Swarthmore, and then two of my good friends at Haverford got pregnant and were on maternity leaves back to back. So Jess Lord gave me a call and said, hey, any chance you're interested in a 9-month appointment while you job search? And it was the absolute best of both worlds. I got to kind of do what I call my victory lap at Haverford and work one more year back at that office. And in the meantime, got a job as the director of admissions at the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law. So that helped me to move to Kansas City. And I was there for a long time, was trying to break into college counseling, and eventually landed at Pembroke Hill, which is an independent school here in Kansas City. And this is my 3rd year now as a college counselor, and I am loving it. And I'm so glad that that things have worked out the way that they have.
Wow, that was quite a journey there. Haverford,
Yeah.
Swarthmore, back to Haverford, law school in Kansas City, and now college counseling. So Julia, what do you want our listeners to know about Lydia that she didn't share?
I have a lot of great things to say about Lydia that she might like me to share or not. But Lydia is truly one of the smartest people I know, not just in this profession, but everywhere. We once crashed by mistake a very competitive quizzo or trivia night when we were visiting colleges together. And Lydia knew all these answers.
That's
And we
how
ended up
Dave
coming,
is, by the way. Dave is
huh?
like that. Dave
Yes.
is that way. He used to play Jeopardy, and he would beat everybody combined. All his family, all my family combined, parents included. He would have more points than all of us combined.
I definitely feel very humbled when I'm talking to Lydia or her answers, but she's also loves food maybe as much as I do too, so that's really nice.
I didn't
So we
think
can
that was
share into
possible.
that. Yes. But also Jess was totally my mentor. We only overlapped for 1 year when I worked at Haverford, but we've stayed colleagues and friends since. And it's just been really lovely keeping that relationship alive, especially because I really rely on her as a thought partner in a lot of these things. And then Lydia is probably also one of the funniest people I know. So I'm really excited that we can stay in touch, and her humor lands over writing and text as well. So
Well, thank you again, Julia, for setting this up.
of course.
Well, I can tell you she's always talking about you in favorable ways. So it's great to have you two together today.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for this week is another podcast that's outstanding. It's actually been around even longer than ours. It's called Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. And Elizabeth Heaton, I think she does an outstanding job. It's one I try to catch most weeks. They also have an outstanding blog, Getting Into College blog as well, where they answer lots and lots of questions about college admissions. But they have a number of people that have all done college admissions or college financial aid. And it's divided into 3 segments. And it's very crisp and efficient. So it's typically like 53 minutes sort of every week. And it's on Thursday every single week. So it's another one of these podcasts. In fact, it's kind of the only other one I know besides ours that just you can absolutely count on the exact time it's going to run. Great content. I really think you'd enjoy it a lot. And I really recommend that you check out Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We'll now return to my interview with Lydia Dagenais and our own Julia Esquivel. So I have to ask a question because it's burning on my mind, and I know it's a tough one right out of the gate. And that is, how are Haverford and Swarthmore different? I mean, you've been at both schools. You know them. You know those institutions really well. I will take a little bit of the edge off it because I know coming right in strong, you're probably thinking, I don't want the Haverford people to hear this. I don't want the Swarthmore people to hear this. So this is how I'm going to put it. So the people that pick SWAT over Haverford, why did they do it? And the people that pick Haverford over SWAT, why did they do it? Does that take a little bit of the edge off of it?
It does. It does. And I have to say, I mean, of course, having worked at both schools, and I went from Haverford to Swarthmore and then back to Haverford again. So I got this question on both sides, in public and information sessions. And what is the honest truth, and what I found really funny after I started working at Swarthmore, is that you couldn't find 2 more alike institutions in some ways. And a lot of that goes, I think, to the Quaker backgrounds. There aren't a ton of Quaker schools out there. There's something just a little bit special. Just the way that that meetings run, the way that students are really trusted with things, the way that they are very empowered, is quite unique to both of those schools in the same ways. And in fact, I would joke, and this is true though, about half of my information session between Haverford and Swarthmore was exactly the same. So, because they're similar sizes, location,
Sure.
all of those things. But when it came down to it, there were a couple of things that were distinct about each school that, for instance, if you were looking for undergraduate engineering, Swarthmore is unique that it has that. Sure. And so that would certainly draw a certain population, certain sports that one school had over the other. But I would say kind of for your typical student,
some people were very naturally drawn to one school over the other. We did have a lot of cross applications because people also saw those similarities. But I would say Swarthmore does have a little bit of an edge of intensity that I felt there that Haverford didn't have in the same way. And it's not to say that Haverford was not very intense in some ways. It's certainly a very rigorous academic culture where people get involved in a lot of things. But at Swarthmore, there was a saying that if your plate is full, you grab another plate. And that is true. Even from the food aspect, Squeebs. So yes, they have a great dining center. But that's just very much the culture of Swarthmore. And so, and that filtered up to the kind of administrative faculty staff sort of levels. And so it was a really, it was a very intense place to be, super productive, just some really amazing leadership and faculty and folks. And I definitely found a second home there, which, I was a little nervous coming from Haverford as an alum and also having worked there. But like I said, that Quaker element is definitely still there, very strong community. So I had an awesome experience there. But Haverford is definitely my home. That's where I was drawn as a student. And that's where I felt, again, a little bit, didn't feel that intensity in the same way, felt a little bit more relaxed. It was just Haverford itself as a school is a very laid back kind of place. And so for me, I think in particular, coming from the Midwest and being a little bit nervous about going to the East Coast, that jived a little bit more with my natural sensibility, I would say.
So I want to tell you what different families say that I have visited both. But first, I want to go all the way back, and I know he will not mind me saying this. This might even be someone you know because you were in Haverford at the time when he was admitted. I don't know if you remember a student named Dominique Dubuquois Dodley. I don't know, does that sound familiar or not? He was a soccer player at Westtown. He got into both schools, and he looked at both. And when he went to SWAT, first of all, there were like either bumper stickers or T-shirts in the bookstore. One that said, "Our library never closes," and another one said, "Anywhere else it's an A." And he was like,
"Oh yeah,
this place is too intense. Who needs that? Relax, I'm out."
I remember that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Those kinds of things were said all the time, for sure. Yeah.
and then here's another story. So a basketball coach at our school, who was the CEO and founder of And One, the shoe company, and he would recruit from certain schools. He had a short list of places that he recruited. And I remember Haverford was on the list, but SWAT was not. And I asked him why, and he's like, different kid. It's a different kid. And the perception is that Swarthmore is quirkier. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but there's a strong perception on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I would get an information session sometimes, and this came more from parents, that they would be like, "Oh, Swarthmore, it's very liberal." I was like, well, so's Haverford. Like, I don't know what you're getting at. And I think they were trying to get at the quirk factor a little bit. And yeah, it's true. I was actually surprised when I started at Swarthmore. I watched a whole bunch of different people's information sessions, and they were very frank about like, yeah, you can be really offbeat and come here and be great. And I think the phrase that somebody uses, like, "let your freak flag fly." It's like, oh, that's a phrase I just wouldn't have said at Haverford.
Right.
Not
so
to say that wouldn't be welcome, but it just wasn't like a leading line that you would put in an information session. And so yeah, I think it definitely, perhaps because of the intensity, really does kind of bring out in people like, yeah, you're here to do a thing, so go do it. And that could be weird, and that could be something that people haven't seen before. But yeah, this is the place for that, and was like very, very tolerant, accepting, encouraging of whatever that might have been. So,
do you think the fact that Haverford was an all-male institution into the 60s, like being right across from Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore was founded co-ed, do you think that plays a role at all in the institutions?
I think that there could be something to that for sure. I mean, I also think back to with Swarthmore's founding, both schools were founded by Quakers, but Swarthmore was founded by a much more progressive branch of Quakers that had split off, and it was founded as a co-ed institution, as you said, and that, again, that kind of ability to buck tradition, I think is central to how Swarthmore views itself and how some of that history and culture plays forward. And Haverford having, I used to talk about Haverford and Bryn Mawr kind of growing up with each other, and truly those schools are so integrated. I took a class at Bryn Mawr every semester that I was at Haverford, except for my very first semester. And of course, Bryn Mawr remains an all-women's institution. But I think that, yes, there was kind of a little bit of that tradition that, I just watched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and she spends a day, she's a Bryn Mawr graduate, and she goes back to Bryn Mawr, and it's very, everybody is so proper, and this is how you do things, and it's a very, classic kind of 1960s view of all women's institutions. So I do think that they were a little bit more, I get that sense when I go to boarding schools sometimes of like, oh, this is, people are dressing up a little bit. Like, this is kind of, there's a pattern, there's a way of doing things I think there could be something to that. And it's tough for me because, I'm a woman, I went to Haverford, so I'm like, I did whatever I want to. And but a lot of those values definitely play forward.
So, Julia, why don't you explain the BICO and the TRICO coalition, just because some people I thought you were talking about Swarthmore, now you're talking about Haverford, now you're talking about Bryn Mawr. You want to talk about that? So our listeners follow that?
So the BICO and the TRICO. So Haverford College, Bryn Mawr College, and Swarthmore College are all part of what is called the Tri-College Consortium, or the TRICO for short. And then the BICO would be Bryn Mawr and Haverford. And I talked about this all the time when I was an admission officer, is that there are some other consortia out there, right? I would obviously think that the Claremont colleges probably are the closest, because truly in proximity, they're literally next to each other. But I think that as good as it gets after that is truly the TRICO and the BICO. Certainly we have the 5 colleges in Western Mass, but Bryn Mawr is really, you could walk to it from Haverford's campus. It is really that close. And there's a shuttle that runs every 10 minutes from the Haverford campus to Bryn Mawr's campus. So while I was at Haverford, there was definitely a lot of BICO love, especially because Bryn Mawr sort of had the better food between the 3 colleges. But I did hear now it's Swarthmore. So I used to even go over on the shuttle and eat dinner a couple times over at Bryn Mawr's.
Hey, don't blame you foodie.
Yes. But also what happens and then for Swarthmore, it's just a little farther away, but it's still much closer than actually a lot of the other college consortia out there. And so the Swarthmore shuttle, I believe, runs like just a little more infrequently, but it's like every 30 minutes or 15 minutes or something. And Swarthmore actually has a couple more majors that aren't represented at the BICO. So what's really special also with this Tri-College Consortium is that students can major and minor at all 3 of those campuses, which is also rare in a consortia. You might be able to take a computer science class, but you certainly can't major in computer science at that other school. So a couple times I actually had students who linguistics, for example, was really popular, and that at the time was only housed at Swarthmore. So I would have Haverford students that would major over at Swarthmore. But also sometimes students liked this style of the department better at a different campus. So for example, some departments were highly theoretical rather than practice based, and so students might pick majoring at this in a major that Haverford had, but it was at Bryn Mawr or Haverford. And then some of my favorites were Haverford does have a senior thesis requirement for all students. Bryn Mawr does not. For so every now and then I'd have a student who'd go major over at Bryn Mawr so they wouldn't have to do the senior thesis. But that was rare because, Haverford students really do really do relish that experience. But also while I was there, and I think it's a little less so now, but it's truly a community between the TRICO. and that we used to do our orientation program for all 3 campuses at the same time. So that would be for low income, first gen, BIPOC students. And so you would have not just your people that you would meet at Haverford, but you would know people and faces over at Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr as well. So it's really alive and well. I never in my time at Haverford ever knew a student that didn't take advantage of the TriCo or the BICO in a meaningful way. And I always like to talk about it with students who are looking at Haverford, and Haverford is a little bit smaller compared to other small liberal arts colleges. So I think not only the location being really suburban right outside of Philadelphia, with a train station literally right off campus, but then you have 2 more campuses to choose from. So if you'd rather go to see the dance concert over at Swarthmore, go do that on a Friday or Saturday night. So TriCo and BICO is a really strong relationship and kind of unique in some other college consortia.
So I have a couple follow-up questions for you on that, Julia. You're not supposed to ask 2 questions at once, but I break all interview rules all the time. You know that. So one question I want to ask is, when you were doing info sessions as a Haverford admission officer, how frequently would you get questions about BICO, TriCo, and that? You clearly have articulated people took advantage of it when they were there. How much was it a factor for them, as they evaluated the schools? So that's question 1. And then if you could also talk about what sometimes is called the Quaker Consortium, that also drafts UPenn into the mix. And I know it's confusing. We got BICO, Bryn Mawr and Haverford, TriCo, add SWAT, and then Quaker, all 3, and then add UPenn.
Yep.
Talk to us about that as well. So if you don't mind taking both of those.
Sure. I talked a lot about it in my info session, especially because the listeners probably remember I went to a small liberal arts college, and now as a counselor, I'm realizing this more, but it is true that if you've got Haverford on your college list, you probably have some other peer institutions that are also small liberal arts colleges, most likely Swarthmore, for example, as well. And so I do think one of the major things about any of the tri-college schools is that they really do have this consortia option that really is not present at other small liberal arts colleges. In addition to a lot of small liberal arts colleges being in more remote or rural locations, so you not only have 2 other campuses really close by, but you're also not rural. So I do think for students who might be looking at small liberal arts colleges, and Haverford might feel just a little small to them compared to others, the TriCo really is something that I think they dialed in on and made them feel a little bit better about their choices that they were making. I'll also say, as someone who went to as a small liberal arts school that was really strong in what I would say the arts and humanities, not that it's not strong in other places, but to me, Haverford as a small liberal arts school is also extremely strong in the sciences. And so sometimes that was really nice for students who, not to say you can't do art at a high level or humanities or social science at a high level, but sometimes also knowing that the TriCo is out there with even more opportunities in their areas of interest was also a factor. I do actually think a lot of people did reference the Quaker Consortium, and I'm reading it right now in the supplements. A lot of the time people mention it, but I would really caution people for thinking that it's kind of like a 4-college consortium. I haven't looked into the policy recently, but when I was there, yes. We shared libraries and things like that with Penn, but the only time you could maybe take some academic credit at Penn was that if Haverford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore did not offer that course, and also you can't be a degree-seeking student over at Penn, so you couldn't because engineering is not at Haverford or Bryn Mawr. You couldn't then go major in engineering over at Penn. It had to be a major that was already represented at Haverford, Bryn Mawr, Swarthmore. So in my time, I only had 1 student that did take advantage of the Quaker Consortium, and that was because it was really hard to find a class that would work for the TriCo, but was only offered at Penn. And that was American Sign Language at the time. So I had a couple of students who went, and that was their foreign language requirement that they fulfilled, was American Sign Language. But I do see a lot of students being like, oh, this is my way into Penn, or they kind of think of it like Barnard, Columbia, and it's really not. And maybe I people can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not maybe it's not like a fourth campus of which you can sample sort of unlimitedly from.
I was reading a questionnaire from a student I'm working with recently, and they said, I'm not interested in a women's college, but I'll look at Barnard because I might be able to backdoor my way into Columbia.
Yes,
and I was like,
yeah.
If only you knew how much their antenna is up for that.
I know. And I would like our listeners to know that Haverford and Bryn Mawr are totally keen to that too. So it is, I will say, for someone who also nearly went to a women's college and then didn't think that that was right for them at the time, and then chose a historically women's college that was now co-ed. I do think sometimes that's helpful for Bryn Mawr students who might really want the spirit of a women's education, the structure and format of that, but also maybe would like to have co-educational experiences more often than not. So that was another sort of factor that some students considered when looking at the TriCo.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Lydia and Julia, two former admission officers at Haverford College, talking about Haverford College and Swarthmore College. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Good morning, friends. And hi, Lisa. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. So, listeners, you may not know this, but Lisa and I have been very excited to do a College Spotlight with you for Marquette for quite some time. She's visited a few times and had very positive visits. I had a sensational visit there last June. I was in Minnesota for a wedding, and I said, I have to get to Madison. I have to get to Marquette. And it was one of the best college visits that I've had. And I really feel like this is a school, and I know you feel this way, Lisa. Could you imagine if the school was like in Boston, like how popular it would be?
It would be like overrun. Yeah.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's schools like this that really help me understand how that term flyover country like got into the vernacular, right? Like the Midwest just gets overlooked, and it has schools like this that if they were on the coast, people would be banging the doors down. So I'm going to go through, share a lot of things, but Lisa's been there twice and I've been there once. So she's going to have a lot to contribute. So let me just dive in. And so it's a Jesuit school, and listeners know that none of the people on our staff are Jesuit, but we hold Jesuit schools in high regard. And you can see a lot of that it's a school with a mission, and they're trying to produce thinkers. They're trying to produce engaged, caring human beings. And from what I can see, they do a really good job of it. So right away, Lisa, I was impressed with their communication with me from the time I scheduled it. It was incredible, their communication. I'm like, this place is incredible. And then when I got there, they gave me 2 tour guides just for me, because I was a counselor. But it's not just me. This isn't about me. There were probably 15 to 17 people on our tour. Every single person had one tour guide, a customized tour guide. Was that your experience or not?
Yes, it was. Because they try to find out what your student's interested in before you come, and then they match you up with a student who is majoring in one of those things. And so it is really helpful because you can ask a lot of very specific questions to that student and really get a sense of what their programs are like.
Yeah, so I was impressed. I had these 2 tour guides, and they were fantastic, and they gave me a really lengthy tour. And then afterward, I also had a meeting with a senior person where I got to pick their brain some more. So I just thought that the individual treatment, but be honest with you, I was more impressed that each NEO family got one, not NEO family. How do I sound here? NEO family. With every family got a personal tour.
Yeah.
So anyway, several things let me say about it. Very impressed with their strong advising, almost all classes under 30. This is a private Jesuit research university right in Milwaukee. It was established in 1881 as Marquette College as an all-male institution. And I know here we go again on the all-male institutions. But check this out. It became the first co-ed Catholic university, not in Wisconsin, not in the United States, in the world. So it's the first co-ed Catholic school in the world in 1909, and that's pretty progressive. I mean, that's before the women's suffrage movement. So, it's now been co-ed for 115 years. Pretty impressive. And it's also one of the largest Jesuit schools in the country. It is the largest private university in the state of Wisconsin. And we'll get more into size and stats and that a little bit later on. But it's organized into 11 different schools and colleges, with its main campus being in Milwaukee. And it does have programs in liberal arts, business, communication, engineering, law, health sciences. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Well, it's primarily undergraduate. About 80% of the students are undergrads. They do have 68 doctoral and master's degree programs, as well as 22 graduate certificate programs. It's 2/3 Catholic, generous merit scholarships. I mentioned before, there's a real emphasis on character, personal growth. There's also a real strong emphasis on service. That's something that just, it's pretty indisputable. You can't miss it. It's a couple blocks from downtown. So depending on what part of campus you're on, you can have a very different impression of Marquette. It's a tight campus. There's only 80 acres. So, and occasionally I'll have people that will visit that will have very different impressions. So if you're on certain parts of campus, it is very concrete. Something like a concrete jungle. I think that's very unfair, though, because when you get into the heart of campus, you've got the green spaces, you've got the quads, you've got the flowers, you've got the trees, plenty of spaces. What you think of as sort of that quintessential campus where you can go throw a Frisbee. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think of it more as like the concrete downtown right in the midst of, it is downtown in the midst of the action, but do you think of it more as a concrete place or more of a place with like green spaces?
I think of it more of a place like with green spaces, and they have that beautiful little chapel there, that is so lovely. And I mean, I think that the heart, like the quad, the central quad, is really pretty. And it's true, like some of the dorms, like if you go further, on the sides of campus, they're going to be more of your high rise kind of situation. But I definitely think that there's a lot of very pretty parts of Marquette.
Yeah, I do too. I would love that quad part. I really, really did. I'm curious because, of course, if you're a new listener, you may not know this, but Lisa lived about 30 years of her life in Chicago and moved to North Carolina. How long has it been, Lisa? Has it been over 2 years now?
Yeah, it's been like 2.5 years.
Gee, wow, time flies. So 2.5 years. But when you were in Vernon Hills and in the Chicago market, I would think Marquette was one of the schools on the radar. Was it on the radar of families? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think there were, probably a handful of kids from my daughter's high school who would go to Marquette every year. And, they're good at a lot of things. They have a great nursing program. They're good for business. They're good for communications, but they're also a liberal arts school. And it's kind of the right distance. So it's maybe, from Chicago, it's 2 hours. From the northern suburbs, it's like 80 minutes. And so I think, they do draw a lot of students from Chicago and the Chicago suburbs.
Yeah, I knew that to be true. I just knew you would ratify that. So, yeah, I'd like to follow up with what Lisa said. Some of the really strong programs, anything health sciences related, they're very strong. Obviously, nursing's a direct admit program that's really strong. Some of the exceptional programs that they have are their direct admit physician assistant program and their physical therapy program. Like these are some of the top programs in the country in their fields, and they're outstanding. But they're so versatile because they've got really good mechanical engineering. They've got a great finance program that's really good. And, they've got a new partnership in the arts too, which is going to give them some unique opportunities there. They've got a really good supply chain management program and a really unique major that's really popular called social welfare and justice. So they've got all the things of a national university in terms of the programming that you like, but then strength also in the liberal arts in a lot of areas. 1/3 are from Wisconsin. They are mostly a Midwest school. Most of their draw is from the Midwest. I feel they're really an underrated gem that people on the coast need to consider. Half the students live on campus. It is a requirement for freshmen and sophomores to live on campus, but about half the students live on campus. Some of the schools it's really comparable to. They're all schools that we've done spotlights on. Loyola in Chicago, very similar to, and of course that's also Jesuit. And then SLU, St. Louis University. I feel those two schools are really similar. And if you like those schools, I feel like you really need to look at Marquette. A couple other schools I feel they're really similar to would be UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, and University of Dayton, which you recently did a spotlight on. And with the exception of UIC, all those other schools, have Catholic or Jesuit affiliation, and they're in cities. Any thoughts on those? Because those are all schools you're familiar with as well, Lisa. Any thoughts on that?
I see the Chicago, UIC Chicago. I feel like that's a bigger beast, and it's more spread out. But absolutely with Dayton and Loyola Chicago
and SLU.
I mean, there's a lot of similarities in terms of their setting and the things that they're good at.
Yeah, and those are, by the way, they're big overlaps. So you want to know who they overlap with? They overlap with SLU, they overlap with Loyola, they overlap with Dayton, they overlap with UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago. And then they do also overlap with a couple of the big flagships in the Midwest, UW, Madison. And you would expect that. I mean, if you're 1/3 Wisconsin, a lot of people are going to be looking at the flagship. There's also a lot of overlap with University of Minnesota and actually UIUC, which is not in the urban setting like all these other schools are. But those are some of their big overlaps. And if people aren't familiar with overlaps, it's a term that refers to when students that apply to your school, where else do they apply? Another term that admission officers often will use for this is cross-apps. Who are your cross-apps? So that's just get a sense of people that look at Marquette, where else do they look at? But notice I didn't have anything really there, East or West Coast, South, largely Midwest oriented. And that's really not surprising because most people do look, like you said before, it's a comfortable distance. A lot of people are going to go to a school within 2 hours, of their location. All right. That's pretty common. So some other things that are pretty cool about Marquette, they have a flagship service experience in South Africa that's legendary, and it's been going on for a really long time in Cape Town, and it draws rave reviews. It's not a huge study abroad school percentage-wise, like an Elon, where Lisa's daughter's at, but draws like 70-80% of their students go abroad. It's closer to 1 in 5, but that Cape Town experience is great. They have tons and tons of service-related programs locally right in Milwaukee, though. Mm-hmm. Tons of them. And as many as 1,000 students will participate in service learning, just locally. Another really niche and amazing program they have is the Les Aspin Center. So this is a Washington, D.C. program. And what this program does is it provides an experiential experience for students in the D.C. area. And they can go there in the summer, or they can go for a semester. And they can also work in an internship that's tailored to their interests or their career goals, while at the same time taking classes. So you're studying in your area of interest and you're doing an internship. And then that can be either a full semester or it can be, like I said, done over the summer. And then after students spend this term at the Les Aspin Center, then students go on to view their experiences, just crucial to the whole sort of foundation or the rest of their life. Many times people reflect back and see that as sort of the genesis of really where they caught their vision. So, I mean, I love programs like that. And I think that that's a pretty amazing program that they have. They do have a core curriculum, and the core curriculum has a few things you should know about. One is foundational courses. And these foundational courses are in things like philosophy, rhetoric, and theology. You do need to know they're going to be coming at it from the Jesuit standpoint, the Jesuit perspective. They also have discovery courses, and these courses, they're interdisciplinary, but they revolve around a theme. And so, they have different themes, and they vary them up. They mix them from year to year, but some of them are pretty exciting. Another marquee program they have is their 5-week Freshman Frontier program. And so this is an opportunity not just to come into a traditional 1, 2, or 3-day orientation, but to really bond and form connections with your classmates and get oriented to the school before you start. So I've got a lot more I want to say on some things. I just want to make one more comment on one thing, Lisa, and then I want you to talk about anything else that sort of stood out to you from your visits. And the one thing I want to say is This is a place with a lot of school spirit. Like that just radiated and emanated from my time on campus. Of course, you know I'm a big basketball guy, and I've been following Marquette since 1977 when they won their national championship under Al McGuire. It's a basketball powerhouse. 3 Final Fours, consistently ranked in the top 20. They don't have football, so basketball is where all the energy is. But they're in the Big East. It's a pretty competitive conference. And so if it really offers a lot because you can have the big time sports. If you want fraternities and sororities, they've got that. If you want to get involved in a wide range of majors, they have that. But this is all in a context of almost all classes under 30. I mean, real access to your professors. So anything else you want to share that stood out to you from your visits there?
Well, I mean, I would say that the primary thing that I have always noticed is how happy and well-adjusted the Marquette students look. They're out in their public spaces and they're studying, they're collaborating with each other, but it's in a relaxed kind of way. No one seems to be super stressed. No one's blowing it off. The kids looked just shiny and happy and social. And I value that a lot. You don't always see that at schools. The more schools you see, the more you realize that's, something that's special. And I think it is really special about Marquette. I think that one of the things that also impressed me is how, they don't just personalize the tour. Like your experience at Marquette as a student can be personalized. They have such good advising and they really can try to work with students to help them figure out what are the opportunities that are best for them. So the students get a fair amount of guidance there, I think, which is also, I think, really helpful. I mean, I always liked Milwaukee as a city. Of course, the lakefront is really beautiful. They've got this beautiful art museum and a bunch of other museums at fronts, and it's beautiful. But I always felt like Milwaukee was sort of like a great starter city for someone who wasn't used to a big city to get their feet wet. It's like compared to Chicago, it's adorable, right? It's smaller. It's not without its problems. Obviously, there are bad neighborhoods in all cities, but I feel like there's a lot there. There's a lot of really nice restaurants. It's sort of a foodie destination in a lot of ways. So I just think Milwaukee's a really interesting place that probably doesn't get the credit that it deserves as a city.
I want to play off the last part you said, doesn't get the credit it deserves. I struggle sometimes. It's not that I struggle. Families that I work with outside of the Midwest, they don't respond greatly necessarily when I tell them about Marquette and it's in Milwaukee. Right away I find sometimes that they have diminished expectations, or sometimes they don't even want to visit. It's more of a challenge than I wish it would be. They don't necessarily respond that way to Chicago. It probably has a lot to do with big sports teams and franchises and things like that. But sometimes I struggle convincing families that Marquette is worth a visit from them. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't at all. In fact, one visit that I went, and I don't know if this admissions rep is still there. I remember her name was Rose. She was a Marquette alumni, and I don't know how her mother managed to pull this off. Thought she was going to visit a school in New York and get to the airport. She's from California.
That is hilarious.
To Milwaukee, and Rose is infuriated with her mother. She's not talking to her. And, but by the end of the tour on the weekend, she loved it. And I think they're from the San Francisco area. And so she went there and then she works there, and her parents since have relocated also to Wisconsin just because they like it so much. But She literally had to be tricked into going to visit it. And I that is my experience with a lot of my, students who are from pretty much any place other than the Midwest. And even people from Minnesota seem to have an attitude towards Wisconsin. Again, one of those interstate rivalries like Michigan and Ohio. I don't get
Well, that could be that. So that does happen. Yeah. When you have a rivalry like that, there's the other place is just, anathema. It's just
yeah. It's it doesn't exist, the Midwest. It's it literally is not something that people even consider. And I think they're really missing out. I mean, it's great because I think it's not as hard to get into just because people haven't really discovered it yet. So, I mean, they have a pretty, like they take a range of students and they give really nice merit aids. So, that works, I guess, for the students who go there. But yeah, I don't know. It's an uphill battle. And I don't think all the parents are going to trick their kids into going there.
No, and I don't necessarily want to recommend that either on this podcast, because I can tell you that can really backfire on you badly. Right. And I'm not trusting you ever again, or at least not for the next 6 to 12 months.
Kids.
Yeah, especially like that. You got them on. No. I love my parents, and I have a great relationship with my parents, but I would have been beyond pissed if they pulled that one on me. I'm telling you.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, who knows? Maybe that was just Rosa's story. It wasn't even true. But they've made for a compelling argument.
I think it was probably true. I think Marquette tries to emphasize integrity. Friends, this concludes the first part of Lisa and I discussing Marquette University. We hope you join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday, I am going to be sharing some more things about the rash of schools that have updated their testing policies and talk about the implications that has. And then I'm going to share some insights from an excellent webinar I attended put on by Case Western Reserve. And then we'll have the final part of Andy Strickler and his interview, where he talks about Connecticut College, and he helps us to understand all things Connecticut College. We hope you'll sign up, by the way, for Andy Strickler doing a one-on-one Q&A with our listeners. Just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, click the events tab, click April 3rd, and sign up. But friends, I close you out with a quote from the great Thomas Edison. Somebody once approached him and said, "Thomas Edison, you're a genius." To which Edison replied, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Great accomplishments depend not so much on ingenuity as on hard work." See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.